Hello, and welcome to part 4 of the history of warfare. We got another 6 battles that we're going to learn about, so let's go. In the mid-8th century, politics in the Tang dynasty were growing dangerously tense. There had been suspicions for a long time that General An was planning on rebelling against the Tang dynasty. After all, he'd built up a strong trust between himself and Emperor Xuanzong, but had basically ruined his relationship with everyone else. Specifically, Li Heng, the heir to Emperor Xuanzong, and Yang Guozhong, the successor to Li Linfu, a powerful official who held the position of chancellor, someone who was heavily involved with military and government affairs. An Lushan felt that he had more leeway to do what he wanted since he viewed Yang Guozhong as being easier to deal with than Li Linfu. But Yang Guozhong wasn't about to sit and watch. He insisted that An Lushan was going to rebel, but Emperor Xuanzong repeatedly dismissed the claims. Yang's suspicions were heightened in the year 755, when An Lushan had 32 of his generals replaced. Relations between An Lushan and the government continued to break down until December 755, when An Lushan, commander of arguably the strongest troops, revolted against the Tang dynasty. From his launching point at Fanyang, he charged towards Luoyang, China's old eastern capital, and captured it after defeating General Feng Shangqing. There, he made his goals clear by declaring himself emperor of the state of Yan in 756, with Luoyang as its capital. The Yan forces advanced in different directions across China, but the two major attacks were the advance towards the western capital at Chang'an and the push towards the east and hopefully later the south. Yan forces managed to capture Chang'an, and Li Heng succeeded his father as Tang emperor, taking on the name of Emperor Suzong. Suzong appointed new generals and rallied support from other allies on the outskirts of the empire and from the Abbasid Caliphate. With their newfound strength, Tang forces held back the Yan advance in the west. In the east, Yan forces made their way towards Suiyang, a key city located on the Grand Canal. Shu Yuan, the administrator of Suiyang, began reaching out to nearby units to gather at the city to defend it. Among those units was the force led by Zhang Shun. In total, the defenders numbered 6,800. In January 757, Yan commander Yin Ziqi arrived at Suiyang with a slightly larger force of around 130,000. That's a ratio of roughly 19 to 1. Regardless, the Tang were ready to defend the city for as long as possible. During the siege, the Tang defenders took several measures to ensure that things would be as difficult as possible for the Yan besiegers. They would play their battle drums every night as if to indicate an incoming attack, but they never actually did anything. This caused the Yan forces to be alert every night and just become sleep-deprived. This went on for a while until the Yan soldiers eventually stopped reacting to the drums altogether and just kept sleeping at night, which is exactly what the Tang wanted, as they were intentionally setting up a sort of boy who cried wolf situation. And one night, the Tang carried out a sortie with some cavalry, successfully killing thousands. Later on, the Tang would manage to strike Yin Ziqi with an arrow, causing some panic among the Yan. Frustrated, Yin Ziqi ordered a retreat, and the siege was lifted. 2 months passed, and the Yan would try again with a replenished army, and the second siege began. Throughout the fighting, the Tang proved to be very effective defenders, killing large numbers of Yan soldiers every time they tried to break through. The stalemate continued for months until August, when the food supplies of the Tang defenders were virtually depleted. The Tang defenders were down to only a fraction of their original strength. Even with the reinforcements brought in by Nan Jiyun, it was really only a matter of time how long the remaining force of 1,600 Tang troops could hold off the Yan until their inevitable defeat. They had the manpower to keep stalling, but food was still a glaring problem. So with all other possible food sources exhausted, the Tang defenders turned to their last resort option of killing and cannibalizing anyone who wasn't able to fight. In these brutal conditions, the Tang somehow continued to hold off against the attacks made by the Yan army until October. Eventually, with just a few hundred defenders left, the city fell to Yan, and Zhang Shun and Shu Yuan were captured and executed. This was a Pyrrhic victory for Yan. Most of the 130,000 soldiers in the army had been killed in battle. In addition, the eastward advance of Yan had been halted at Suiyang for all 9 months, and the rebellion as a whole had basically lost its steam. and by this point An Lushan himself had been assassinated and replaced by his son An Qingshu, and the Tang dynasty was able to recapture Chang'an and Luoyang by 758. In the following years, An Qingshu was assassinated and replaced by Shi Siming. Shi Siming was able to retake Luoyang and made an attempt towards Chang'an, but was halted. Then he was assassinated and replaced by Shi Chaoyi, who was revealed to be a pretty ineffective leader. In 762, the Tang again retook Luoyang under the leadership of Emperor Daicong. Shi Chaoyi was captured by the Tang in 763 and chose to take his own life, marking the end of the rebellion. The war left the Tang dynasty greatly weakened and depopulated, and they suffered attacks by the neighboring Tibetan Empire, but over the years they worked to recover from one of its most devastating conflicts. In 840, King Louis the Pious of the Carolingian Empire died of illness. His eldest son Lothair was declared the successor to the whole kingdom, but his siblings Louis II and Charles the Bald refused to recognize his authority and kicked off a 3-year-long civil war that ended in 843 with the Treaty of Verdun, which split the empire into 3 states. West Francia was to be controlled by Charles, Middle Francia by Lothair I, and East Francia by Louis the German. Now, during that civil war, Danish Vikings took the opportunity to conduct raids inside Frankish territory. These raids continued throughout the 9th century, even laying siege to Paris as early as 845. In 864, Charles decided to take action and make some military reforms. The Edict of Pitre ordered the creation of a mobile cavalry force that could be called upon at any moment to respond to threats posed by the Vikings. There would also be additional bridges constructed along cities that were located on rivers, and a strict weapons embargo was imposed against the Vikings. By the year 884, multiple kings had come and gone, and Charles the Fat was now the king of East Francia, and had also gained control of West Francia, being named the king of the whole Carolingian Empire. In 885, 2 Danish rulers, Sigfrid and Sinrik, sailed to West Francia and entered their territory through the Seine River. Despite the efforts of the Franks to stop their advance, the Viking fleet continued to sail up the Seine, eventually reaching Paris in late November 885. The 2 bridges on both sides of the fortified island blocked the advance of the fleet, and the entrances were secured by bridgeheads, preventing the Vikings from fully surrounding the city. The defenders would need to be careful, as their initial numbers were only a couple hundred, and the Viking numbers were in the thousands to tens of thousands. After the Parisians under Otto, Count of Paris, refused to pay tribute, the Vikings began their siege. Following a failure to breach the city's defenses, the Vikings set up a camp on the right bank of the river, then made plans to breach the northern bridge. 2 months into the siege, they began to dump piles of junk and dead bodies on the shallow parts of the river, and even made an attempt to destroy the bridge using burning ships. A few days later, the river started to overflow because of rain combined with the junk filling up the river, and the bridge collapsed, allowing the Vikings to take out the bridgehead tower. In April 886, Siegfried left Paris, leaving his soldiers under the command of Rollo. With the situation becoming more dangerous, Otto left Paris to seek reinforcements from King Charles. If the siege lasted long enough, the Vikings would be too demoralized to continue and would likely retreat. But if the defenders didn't receive any help, they were at risk of letting Paris fall. Luckily, Otto returned with a small army and fought his way back into the city and held off the pursuing attackers. The Vikings continued to try assaulting the city, but failed to break through. Finally, in October, Charles the Fat arrived with a large force, pushing back the Vikings and lifting the siege. Instead of finishing off the Viking force under Rollo, Charles intentionally let them escape and sail further up the Seine River, in hopes of having them raid the region of Burgundy, which was currently in revolt. The Vikings did eventually retreat from France after receiving payments of silver. The way in which the siege and the Viking attack was handled by King Charles heavily damaged his reputation, and the imperial government later collapsed into infighting. As a result, the east-west division of the Carolingian Empire was no longer one of convenience. They were now 2 fully separate entities that would go on to become the predecessors of the future French and German states. Since the late 7th century, the Byzantine and Bulgarian empires had fought a series of conflicts. In the 10th century, their hostilities had become an on-and-off situation. Tsar Simeon led many successful campaigns, overseeing Bulgaria's largest territorial extent. They'd pushed the Byzantines back to Constantinople and put immense financial pressure on them, but in 924 stopped short of actually conquering the city. Simeon had also fought against the Magyars to their north, also known as Hungarians. At times, the Hungarians collaborated with the Byzantine Empire to fight against the Bulgarians. This changed in 927 when Peter I became the Emperor of Bulgaria. He arranged a peace agreement with the Byzantine Empire that saw them become more like allies rather than enemies. With that in mind, we now look at the Pechenegs, a nomadic Turkic group who had presence in the northeast. Given their reliability and proximity, they were often employed by both Bulgarians and Byzantines to fight against the Hungarians, who remained a threat to the two empires. Later on, as the Hungarians and Pechenegs were in the midst of a conflict, the Byzantines attempted to take advantage by attacking them during the fighting. This prompted the Hungarians and Pechenegs to form a temporary alliance to strike back against the Byzantines. The attackers had come from a city called W.l.n.d.r, spelled like this in Arabic and like this if you're writing it the Latin alphabet, because God knows how you actually pronounce it. Anyway, it seems like this city was located within Bulgarian or Byzantine territory, but it is believed that W.l.n.d.r could have been in the same place as Belgrade, and that's what I'll use for this video. Anyway, the soldiers who committed the attack were Byzantines stationed at W.l.n.d.r, so in the year 934, a combined army of tens of thousands of Hungarians and Pechenegs went south and attacked the city of W.l.n.d.r, which held off the invaders. In response, the Byzantine Empire sent 62,000 soldiers to defend the city and set up camp nearby. The two armies met on the battlefield and engaged in combat, with neither side gaining a major advantage by the end of the day, though the Byzantines had been performing better thanks to their superior numbers. On the second day, the Hungarian Pecheneg army changed up its tactics, now under the command of the Pecheneg king. The right and left flanks, made up of mounted archers, took turns performing maneuvers where they would sweep past the enemy line, fire arrows at the enemy, and quickly fall back to the other side of their own line as the next one began their turn, resulting in an uninterrupted shower of arrows on the enemy. This turned out to be very effective and started to cause serious damage to the Byzantine army, who responded by charging forward in an attempt to take out the isolated groups of horsemen. But they moved out of the way, allowing the main part of the Hungarian Pecheneg army to attack the weakened Byzantine center. Realizing their mistake, the Byzantines tried to quickly retreat, but the nomadic army caught up to them, and the mounted units located on the flanks surrounded them on opposite sides. This devastated the Byzantine army, who suffered heavy losses and fled from the battlefield. With them gone, the Hungarian Pecheneg army successfully took W.l.n.d.r and pillaged the city. Following the victory, the nomadic army continued further south to Constantinople and remained at the city walls for over a month until the Byzantines agreed to pay tribute to the Hungarians. The Hungarians would continue to be at odds with other European powers, and after the death of the Bulgarian Tsar Peter I in 969, the relationship between the Bulgarian and Byzantine empires would again fall into conflict. So here's another case where, if you know anything about military history, this battle should be pretty familiar. On January 5, 1066, King Edward died without any clear successor, causing a succession dispute over who had the right to rule the Kingdom of England. The immediate successor was Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, but his decision to step up and take the throne caused some anger overseas in Norway and Normandy. When it came to Norway, King Harald Hardrada had a claim to England based on his predecessor's agreements. The Danish king Harteknut had in the past ruled over English territory before they were pushed out, and when he died in 1042, his lands would be passed on to his successor, Magnus, who was also the king of Norway. At the time of his succession, the lands being passed on to Magnus did not include England. He would only inherit the Kingdom of Denmark. Despite this, he still named England as his own claim, even though King Edward had already taken control of England. When Magnus died in 1047, Sweyn II inherited Denmark, and Harald Hardrada inherited Norway. Now, because Magnus had claimed England as his own, then Harald, who inherited Magnus's claim, could technically also claim England for himself. He tried to conquer Denmark, but in 1064 he and Sweyn agreed to recognize each other as kings of Norway and Denmark. Having failed to conquer Denmark, Harold turned his attention towards England. When it came to Normandy, Duke William had been named as a successor by Edward. Pretty simple, right? The issue is that Edward had also named Harold Godwinson as his successor, so by the time he died, it was still unclear who was the actual successor. This is why, when Harold Godwinson took the throne, William felt like he got cheated out and began making preparations for an invasion of England. By August 1066, William's invasion fleet was ready to go, but due to reports that Harold Godwinson had prepared coastal defenses and the fact that the windy conditions prevented proper navigation, the attack was delayed. Meanwhile, Harold Hardrada arrived on the eastern coast of northern England, occupying the region. In late September 1066, Harold Godwinson met Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, in which Harold Hardrada was killed. The remnants of the Norwegian army retreated from England, allowing Harold to focus on the threat from William, who had already landed in England with maybe roughly 10,000 soldiers. After arrival, William moved to the town of Hastings to set up a castle. When Harold marched south and approached with maybe roughly 10,000 soldiers or less, William departed Hastings and confronted Harold on October 14, 1066. The English were stationed at the top of a hill, forming a shield wall. The Normans were at the bottom of said hill, with their force split into 3 sections, with William at the center. The Normans made the first move, firing arrows up at the English, which was kind of difficult. The Normans then advanced their spearmen to try and break through the English line, but failed, so they sent the cavalry to support them, but they still couldn't break through. Soon after, intentionally or not, the Normans fell back in retreat, prompting many of the English units to pursue them and
"This was, in fact, a trap."
Or at least that's how it turned out, because the idling Norman troops surrounded the pursuing English and defeated them before going on to launch a counterattack against the remaining forces, resulting in Harold Godwinson dying in battle. Having just lost their king, the English nobility scrambled to nominate Edgar Atheling, so William marched towards London. When it became clear that the English could no longer repel the Normans, they all surrendered. William's coronation took place on December 25th, and he spent the first few years of his reign having to put down resistance across the kingdom, but he eventually secured his holdings of both England and Normandy. In 1095, Byzantine Emperor Alexius Komnenos sent out a call for military assistance from Pope Urban II in response to the westward expansion of the Seljuk Empire, emphasizing the mistreatment of Christians in Seljuk territory and the need to liberate the Holy Land. This kicked off a centuries-long series of religious wars known as the Crusades. After a smaller initial expedition failed, a larger force was gathered and successfully made it all the way to Jerusalem, ending the war in 1099. The First Crusade was a major success, and several Crusader states were created in the region, one of them being the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Over the course of the 12th century, the Seljuks would lose some of their presence in the area, and the Zengids would become the next biggest threat to the Crusader states, taking out the county of Edessa in 1144. The Zengids would later lose their power, and the Crusaders were able to repel the Fatimid Caliphate to their south. Things would change in 1171 when Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, or just Saladin, became vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate. He initially didn't have much support, but after consolidating power in Egypt, he changed his allegiance from the Fatimid Caliphate, which followed Shia Islam, to the Abbasid Caliphate, which followed Sunni Islam. And in 1174, he established the Ayyubid dynasty, with himself as its first sultan. Having conquered much of the Levant, Saladin posed a major threat to the Crusader states. In 1177, a teenage King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem launched an invasion into Egypt with support from the Byzantine Empire, while Saladin was occupied with a campaign up north near Damascus, but they failed to go through with their plan and had to retreat. Later that year, Baldwin joined Count Raymond III of Tripoli on a campaign in Syria, allowing Saladin to turn the tables and invade the Kingdom of Jerusalem while Baldwin was occupied up north. Baldwin then had to hurry back to secure his kingdom. One of the main targets during this conflict was the Jacob's Ford, located on the Jordan River, and also a good checkpoint between Jerusalem and Damascus. Knowing the importance of it, Baldwin ordered fortifications to be set up. Saladin tried to pay Baldwin to not build it, but he of course refused, so Saladin then decided that he needed to destroy the castle before it could be reinforced and pose a threat to him in the future. By the time the Ayyubids arrived in August 1179, the castle was already in working condition, and they were forced to begin a siege. The Ayyubids under Saladin began by having his units fire arrows at the defenders. His troops on the outside drew attention away from his actual plan for the siege, which was to dig tunnels underneath the walls of the castle using supports to hold up the ground above. Then, the miners would retreat, setting the supports on fire, and the walls would collapse behind them because they'd be too heavy for the hollowed-out ground to hold it up. It's similar to what happened with the siege of Jerusalem that I talked about in episode 2. Unfortunately for Saladin, this didn't happen. So the fire had to be put out, the miners had to go back in, widen the tunnels so that the ground would be even more unstable, then get out and relight the fire. And the whole process took several days, and Baldwin was now making plans to come with reinforcements to Jacob's Ford. That didn't really matter though, since the Ayyubid efforts to collapse the walls succeeded, and they stormed the castle, ending the siege after just 1 week. Baldwin finally approached Jacob's Ford with his reinforcements, only to see that the Ayyubids had already taken the castle, and he had to retreat. Saladin planned on continuing, but after some logistical issues that resulted from drought, he ended up stopping the campaign altogether when Baldwin offered a truce in 1180. 7 years later, in 1187, the Ayyubids would secure more territory in the Middle East and successfully drove the Crusaders out of Jerusalem, which prompted the Christian kingdoms of Europe to begin organizing the Third Crusade. In 1206, Temujin, who had worked to unify the nearby Mongolian tribes into a single group under his leadership, took on the name Genghis Khan, marking the beginning of the Mongol Empire. From the Mongol heartland, they saw tremendous military expansion across Central Asia, coming into conflict with other large states, such as the Jin dynasty and the Khwarezmian Empire. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire ended in 1221, and the Mongols now had a growing presence in the Middle East as well as the outskirts of Europe. One European power that was of interest to the Mongols was the Kievan Rus, which was once a unified state, but was now a union of various principalities. Having just concluded their conquest of Khwarezmia, General Subutai and Jebe began a campaign with 20,000 soldiers into Eastern Europe that was half invasion, half reconnaissance. From their position in Persia, they went north through the Caucasus, encountering heavy resistance in Georgia before crossing to the other side in 1223. They were able to move further west in southern Ukraine, which was held by the Cumans. At first, the principalities of the Kievan Rus didn't make any moves. They had no interest in defending the Cumans. But once the Mongols reached the Dniester River and began heading north, they realized the danger and began mobilizing a coalition force of principalities. The total number of soldiers in this force is unknown, so I'm trusting the figure of 15,000. Take that with a grain of salt. The princes closed in on the Mongols by advancing on both ends of the Dnieper River. The Mongols tried reaching out to them diplomatically, insisting that they only wanted to fight the Cumans, but after their envoys were killed, they declared war on the Rus. Aware that they would soon be trapped, the Mongols split their force, leaving behind a small rearguard while the rest of the army retreated east. This rearguard would end up being a sacrifice, as once the troops under Prince Mstislav of Chernigov crossed the river and attacked them, they were annihilated. After this, the Mongols purposely continued to retreat eastward while the Rus coalition pursued them for several days. Once they reached the Kalka River, the Mongols turned around and engaged the Rus, firing on them with arrows. While the Rus army was crossing the river, the Mongols launched a surprise attack by charging at them directly, which was very effective. During the fighting, the Cumans, who were fighting alongside the Rus coalition, could no longer fight and retreated from the battlefield. The Rus opened their lines up to allow them to pass through, but this was a big mistake, because the Mongols rushed the gap. Then, the army of Chernigov, who had yet to arrive on the battlefield, fell into confusion as they collided with the Cumans, so they were unable to reinforce the rest of the Rus coalition. This allowed the Mongols who were pursuing the Cumans to attack the Chernigov army while they were unprepared, and Prince Mstislav was killed in battle. After this, the Mongols encircled the Rus, wiping most of them out, with the exception of a few princes that managed to escape. From the start, the Mongols were there for reconnaissance of Eastern Europe, so once they'd finished looting the area, they retreated east back to Mongol territory. The mission was a huge success, having defeated the Rus in battle and gathered a lot of valuable intelligence, and for the first time, Europe learned of a new threat in the east. They'd be spared from attacks for the time being, but a full-scale Mongol invasion would take place in the years to come. Okay, there we go. I managed to get this episode out without procrastinating an entire year. So here's the deal. I think I did a better job with this one, but one thing I want to do for part 5 is to include some kind of reference list or have some kind of sources listed. Because I know that even if I do try to improve the visual quality of the videos, they still won't be good enough for the academic purpose. History can be told however you want, and when you don't provide sources, it makes the product not as reliable as it could be. And even though I am genuinely trying to tell the honest history for the sake of learning, you gotta have the sources, because otherwise you're just taking my word for it. Another thing is that I'm in college now, so I will see some changes in my personal schedule, so maybe I won't have as much time to work on videos, maybe I will have more time, depends on, my work pattern. But on the other hand, I will have access to some more resources that I hope will increase the quality, such as this microphone that I'm using. It's the university microphone. And overall, I want to improve this series with each episode. So I do have high expectations for myself in part 5, whenever that may come. And since I do want to do some videos on other topics, they could range from still doing this to history to stuff about video games. It's whatever I feel like making. This channel has no real focus, to be honest. But whatever it is, I hope you'll watch it, and I'll see you in the next video. It's gonna be great.